It's the end of the 16th century, and there are humanists running around willy-nilly, being all artsy and not a little bit fartsy. There's a strange feeling in the air, like they want to bring ancient Greece back. The Rennaisancers had focused on biting the entire bit of the ancient Greeks and Romans, so the Florentine Camerata, arguably the most hipster of any group not based in or around Williamsburg, Brooklyn, decided it was time to bring Greek drama back. Also, they really liked music. And so, Jacopo Peri, Ottavio Rinuccini, created the first modern opera, Dafne. A retelling of the even then done to death Daphne myth. Was performed in 1598. And I would do an entire podcast series about it, if it weren't almost entirely lost. But Peri's next significant work survives, and that's where my journey starts. What journey, you may ask? Well, I grew up going to the symphony with my grade school class, the lollipop concerts they would call them. I was secretly buying Mahler and Philip Glass CDs along with the specials and Guns N' Roses at Tower Records during high school. I listened to the hits of Stravinsky on our left side of the radio dial. I loved orchestral music. I loved string quartets. And yeah, I loved death metal, ska, punk, jazz, bubblegum pop, goth, funk, y'alternative, and musicals, and on and on and on. But you know, I never got into one of the forms of music that helped define the art music world. One of the forms of musical expression that some point to as the peak of the Western cultural experience. I just never got into it. And you know what? My goal for 2024 was to get into it. Hard. Because I really want to like opera. Hi. My name's Chris Garcia, and I know absolutely nothing about opera. But you know what? I'm going to change all that. You know why? Because I really want to like opera. Howdy. I'm Chris Garcia. I'm an archivist, a writer, and a pro wrestling enthusiast. I'm decidedly not the target audience for opera these days. When I started looking into the opera world, I wanted to go to the very beginning. But I almost immediately discovered that the first modern opera, which pretty much everyone agrees is Dafne, was lost, like tears in the rain. Jacopo Peri's follow-up, though, is still around, and is widely produced. Thus, I headed to YouTube to find it. Now, this is an interesting note. The Florentine Camerata were trying their damnedest to relaunch Greek drama. So, while the first one was about Daphne, another story of the ancients, the second one, and the oldest surviving, was based on another myth, Eurydice. That's right, we've been recycling content for new media since the beginning of time. Like everything I do, I had to dig into the deepest history, and with opera, that's pretty deep. There have been songs that tell stories, going back beyond recorded history. The oldest existing songs are either religious songs or story songs, or workmen's songs, like the Egyptian song that tells the story of the two brothers. These were often sung to give rhythm or to show a progression of things. Some of it, of course, was to pass down tradition, myth, legend, religious concepts. But sometimes it was just for the sound of it, so that you knew you did this at this with this intonation, you did this at this intonation, so on and so forth. The opera, in many ways, eschews these sort of songs, which sort of moves it out of how we would move forward with music, though there are some pretty notable exceptions to that. Now, the explicit use of theatricality, that these were stage stories, well, for at least the first 500 years or so, they needed to be presented in a more or less specific context. That is, telling a story through the use of music that is produced and presented in a particular way. Now, the key there is the storytelling aspect. And though opera has grown and in many, I would say, significant ways, moved beyond the concept of storytelling, but that's a whole nother episode. Now, we do see references to opera in popular cultural musical expressions, even today. From the 80s, one of my personal favorites is Malcolm McLaren's Madame Butterfly, and I'll talk about that way down the road. opera didn't end up having nearly the influence on modern music that orchestral music did. And it's possible that is because of the very defined nature of what opera is and could be. It did lead to the musical, but that's a whole nother podcast for another lifetime. But this idea that you told a story through a series of, if you kind of boil it down, through a series of songs. But they're specifically songs sung by characters. And there is a set of, I wouldn't say rules, but guidelines, definitely, or at least tropes, that make opera a very, very narrowly determined field, at least through much of the history of opera. Now, the idea to revive Greek drama is interesting, because it's not like the 16th century was some dead zone for theater. The Brits were doing a lot with theater at the time, and not just Shakespeare, who was alive and presumably well, if he ever existed. And Peri's operas debuted during a time of sort of Italianate rebirth, which is interesting that happened during the Renaissance, at least the end of it. Now, in Italy, though there is a long history of theatrical starts and stops, basically beginning with ancient Roman theater, which recycled Greek dramas for the most part, but they'll also produce some impressive comedies of their own. Now, the fall of Rome did produce a dead period, but slowly over time, the church brought it back, using actors and theatrical presentation to tell stories of parables and other Catholic niceties, kind of to break up the monotony. And this placed the center for a majority of drama within churches in Italy, which only started to change with the rise of Commedia dell'arte, which took the show to the streets or town plazas or wherever you have. Anywhere you could put up a stage, you could put on a show. That led us to vaudeville, and on and on. Now, in Ferrara and Rome, there were those who had been studying and even translating ancient Greek texts for nearly a century, dating back to the very end of the 15th century. And they had started to produce them in theatrical settings, not necessarily theaters, but the courts, various other settings that were not the church. And no matter what the form of artistic expression, there will always be the indies, always the people who go out to do it on their own. Now, the division between traditional drama and liturgical plays is actually fairly stark, and at the time more or less divided into dramas, which were mostly what the church was presenting, and comedies, which were secular. Though, when you presented a Greek play, it was always seen as secular, whether or not it was a comedy or a drama. And I'd wager they would have held closer to the dramas than the comedies. That's not to say there were not original dramas that were being produced at the time, especially in Rome. So, if reviving Greek drama was already happening in Rome and Ferrara, why was opera needed? And the answer is pretty simple. The Florentine Camerata made an interesting guess. The Camerata believed that the choruses and their participation in Greek drama, that all of that was originally sung. And this is something of an outsider concept, though there is some evidence that might well have been the case, at least at times. They also thought that maybe, just maybe, the entire things had been sung, and those dumb Ferrarans and the smug intelligentsia of Rome had completely botched their revivals because they didn't realize that. Never underestimate battles for intellectual superiority between states. Now, Italian music has always been there. The Romans had music. I mean, how could you not? They tended towards ancient Greek tunings on instruments, but the fall of Rome introduced musical traditions from more of Europe. While there were countless local folk songs, and remember, Italy wasn't really Italy until the 19th century, so there would have been different languages which required different folk songs, even if those languages were somewhat mutually intelligible, and occasionally you would find a folk song that showed up in many areas in languages that were roughly the same. Now, there was liturgical music, chants and plain song from the monks, and some early choir-type things, and there were madrigals, which tended to be less used in religious settings than in courtly settings. And there were early versions of the orchestras as well, though, again, fuzzy. One thing that was an important individual aspect of the rise of the scene that led to opera was monody. And these were accompanied solo voice piece. Now, the idea is here that this is supposedly a revival of Greek musical practices by the folks of the Camerata. But They went in more for the spirit than any sort of historical accuracy, which is absolutely true of everything in any sort of revival. As it goes, they tend to try to get a little more because they tend to be able to research better. This is 100% evidenced by the early Ren fairs. They were wearing the conical hats still and so forth. They weren't capturing the accuracy, and in some cases they didn't want to, because there are lots of parts of the Renaissance and the medieval period that you really don't want to bring back. But here, they probably just didn't have access to a lot of the original things, an original information that would have made it possible. Now we actually have a better idea, even though we're hundreds of years removed. We have a better idea of what the ancient Greeks did. Though we still can't figure out the Antikythera mechanism, but that's a whole nother podcast for me, which I will do. Now, the monody was designed as an expression of emotional content, often with stories attached and almost always in character. Now, these could be seen as the first step towards arias, and it's this stream that fed into the likes of Jacopo Peri and the company that did the first operatic works that we would recognize today. Now, after a solid week of digging into early Italian musical history, it was time to actually approach listening to an opera. All cards on the table. This is not the first time I've listened to an opera. I've actually seen a couple. Two I saw relatively the same time. I don't know which came first. Was at Boston Symphony Hall, where I saw Madame Butterfly. And then in San Francisco, around the same time, I saw Nixon in China. I've also listened to Einstein on the Beach and a couple of other ones. I want to say I've actually heard La Bohème when I was on a big Rent kick. Actually, I shouldn't say I listened to opera. I heard opera. I had no idea what any of it was, no clue what any of it meant. The history, the ideas, the differences that mattered, the similarities that led to definitions, none of that. I guess I was saving that for the days when I would have more time, like in my early 50s, with 2 9-year-olds running around the house, a job with an hour commute daily into the mountains, an active publishing life. Sure, that was a perfect time to pick up a new hobby. But you know what? I'll be damned if I do not become an operaphile. There are 3 versions of Eurydice on YouTube. And I chose one that I rather liked because it started with terrible introduction theme. Literally, it's MIDI music of what they thought Italian medieval music might sound like, I guess. But the group performing it were graduate students at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, with a few faculties sprinkled in among them to round things out, I guess. And it's a lovely version. One of the ones I found on YouTube, it was easily the most fulfilling as far as what I want out of an easily accessible opera. There was an emotional resonance to it. And I don't want to say an authenticity, but it felt like they weren't trying to revive like the Florentine Camerata did without a sense of historical accuracy. But at the same time, it felt like it was being made to be approachable to a modern audience. And it's a very, very interesting. Looking at the 3 that I watched, it was easily the one that felt most like it could have happened in their time, but also the one that had an emotional resonance that spoke to me as a listener in the 21st century. Now, let's get into the story of Eurydice. Well, as this is a part of reviving Greek drama, to have Eurydice as one of the first pieces makes total sense. There are no surviving Greek play versions of just the Orphic story, or Orpheus and Eurydice, though it appears in reference to in a number of works, both Greek and Roman. And there were most likely Greek and Roman adaptations of the story that just didn't survive. We have so little Greek drama. And, there are, I think, a couple of hundred plays total that we have either a fair portion of or all of. But I look at it like silent film. We have about 90% of silent films missing. And that's of the ones we have documented. There's probably hundreds and thousands of films that there is no documentation of. We could lose entire genres that we just won't know existed shortly, because anyone who had any personal experience with them will pass away and leave no trace. Now, the story of Eurydice has been told and adapted hundreds of times since this. Most famously, I think, by Jean Cocteau. Or Cocteau? Is it the Cocteau twins? I can never remember. I can only pronounce things as they relate to pop bands of the 1980s and 90s. So, the libretto was created by Ottavio Rinuccini, and it opens with La Tragedia, the tragic muse, who sings entreaties to the audience for emotional reaction. And that's a prologue that structurally feels straight out of a Greek play, though I think it would have been done by a chorus as opposed to a single singer. And it's basically telling the audience that there are going to be different tones coming at them soon. I'm not 100% sure from my reading of it, but I think this kind of serves the same purpose as a TV theme song. It tells you what you're about to see and experience, and it gives you the tone of the larger piece. So, in my head, this is closer related to the works like the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air theme or the Brady Bunch. It's setting the table for you. Okay, during this whole thing, sometimes I'm going to make a reach. Deal with it. Now, listening to this on its own and not speaking a lick of Italian, I feel this is, stiff? But a lot of opera does, which is why it can be a daunting hill to climb for someone who hasn't, really dug into it before. On one hand, there is clearly something going on within the music and singing that is establishing both mood and tone, though as we're a few hundred years divorced from the creation of the work, these connotations may very well be completely different today than they were at the time. No work is timeless, as the legendary William Saroyan said. But this one has something that I can latch onto when I dig into the translation of the lyrics being sung. It's fascinating to listen to while reading the text of the Italian and the English translation. And it's side by side on the video that I'll link in the show notes, because the first time I listened to it, I was reading the Italian translation to see how the voice, with all the trills and the drawn-out vowels, matched up with the Italian words. And that actually allowed me to attach more strongly to the idea that the singer is interpreting actual words. Because it's very easy just to hear opera as this is a vocalist singing sounds, using their voice as an instrument as opposed to a communication device. And I found that to be really important once I started to read the Italian. Then the next, I read the English translation while I was listening. And that's where I started to try to enjam the English into the sounds that were being produced in Italian. And it actually kind of worked at times. There's a really interesting portion after the tragic muse has this lovely conversation with some shepherds. And Daphne enters. And I'm guessing this might be the earliest version of fan service done in opera. It's like people are going, hey, it's Daphne. Remember her from the last one they did? And of course she announces that Eurydice has been bitten by a serpent and is dead. Killing off the title character in the first act, and not even on stage, that is a choice. Orfeo, as he's called here, but is usually referred to as Orpheus, was a bard, a poet, and a Thracian, if you believe Plutarch. Orfeo, usually called Orpheus, was a bard, a poet, and a Thracian, if you believe Plutarch. Pretty much all the ancients, save for Aristotle, believed Orpheus was a real person. And it's interesting, I think it's more analogous to Robin Hood now than it is to comparing Orpheus to one of the gods. Because they weren't gods, they were sort of humans who had existed. Thus, this story, though which obviously has mythic elements, is a story of humans. Hence, when the Romans translated things, they always were changing gods' names. They didn't change Orpheus or Eurydice. An interesting note. Now, the idea, of course, and again, parallels to King Arthur, Robin Hood, any of those sort of characters, or more recently, and actually possibly time-wise better, like John Henry. His exploits may have been based on actual events that were simply exaggerated, or they may have been invented whole cloth, but hung on someone who may or may not have actually existed, or was at least inspired by someone who did. But the thing is, there are many songs and poems that were attributed to Orpheus in this time. So there's a lot of possibilities here. Now, in the show, Orfeo and Eurydice are married, and all the nymphs celebrate with him. And after he sings a bit about being totes comfortable in this world, Daphne comes and drops the bad news that Eurydice has died, which leads him to declare his intent to go and plead to bring her back to life. I would say that is the I've got to song in this. So he's off to the underworld, and there's a whole thing where Orfeo is talking with various underworlds type Venus, Chiron, Rhadamanthus, Pluto, of course, and a few others. I don't remember if he talks to Cupid or not. I don't think so. But Venus and Pluto are basically the most important, because Venus gives Orfeo the idea to sing for Eurydice's release from Pluto. And since Orfeo is able to hit a banger when he needs to, it's a great idea. Now, Pluto is so moved, he releases Eurydice, and they run back to Thrace together. The last half of the opera is largely in a form called recitativo. I'm not a guy who speaks Italian or English very well. And it's a form that's supposed to resemble spoken language more than operatic singing. Now, I read this, and I started listening. I actually read this before I started listening. And I kept waiting for it to happen, because it all sounded like opera to me. I guess I was expecting something more like the talk singing you find by Rex Harrison in My Fair Lady. But I was told this was something different. And I started to dig into the sensation of the singing and the relationship of the words being sung. It became pretty clear the portions where it's supposed to be a conversation between characters are far more, well, I guess, clear. And I opened up two windows on YouTube and I listened to the portion of the prologue, the portion where it's just La Tragedia, and the portion a bit later where we encounter La Tragedia with the shepherds and the Eurydice, and they were conversing. And there was certainly a different set of markers to each, and I wasn't sure if it was just less adorned, which I think might be it, or if they were simply allowing the language just hit harder. There's a change in the pace of delivery, that's for certain. But this is something I'm going to explore. One of the things I want to do with this podcast is to look at ideas that happen and try to give sort of a explanation. I hope to talk to some folks who do opera so I can actually get, like, examples. So in the end, Eurydice and Orfeo are back together, and everything's right in the world. Now, the best portion of the whole thing is an exchange between Orfeo and Pluto, who is called Plutone in the opera, where Pluto says that Orfeo can take Eurydice home.
Fortunati miei dolci sospiri, o ben vessati pianti, a me felice sovra
Let me translate that for you. Descend, noble lover, within our threshold, and your beloved wife take bath with you to the serene and pure sky above. Orfeo. How fortunate my sweet sights! How well spilled my tears! How happy am I above all others! Now, I read that as basically he's praising his own performance at the same time as saying, hell yeah, it worked! And that resonated with me. That brought out something I learned from studying musical theater. It's like I mentioned earlier, there's, the I've got to, I wish, I want songs. But there's one that I love, which I call the Take It On Home song. And it's really where the story of a play wraps up, even if it's not the end of the play. Usually it's not the end of the play. There's usually a denouement. But if you look at, Sweeney Todd has a very famous one that is almost the entire end of the play. You have Cabaret, Life is a Cabaret. Guys and Dolls, Marry the Man, or Luck Be a Lady Tonight, or Sit Down, You're Rocking the Boat. Actually, I would probably say it would be Sit Down, You're Rocking the Boat. And it's here where the opera ends, and the rest is trying to tie up the loose ends and letting us know how happy and terrible their world is now. It's clearly what this is. And you also get more shepherds, which I like. So what did I feel and what did I learn? First, Eurydice is the base, not the bridge to opera. It's incredible because it feels fully formed. My limited exposure to other operas left me with this formal feeling, which might come across as strange considering that it's also structured. But it's also entirely close to how Greek drama, when I've encountered it, would have been presented if it was spoken. There is that sort of stiffness, that structure. And I think that's acceptable when you're dealing in homage. And that's what this feels like more than anything, an homage. Now, I've read and listened to a bunch of interpretations of the Orphic story, from Hadestown to the awesome Ollie Davis version of it, music by Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds. This one lacks the more modern psychological explanation that most modern takes have, or the feminist interpretation, really, that has been sort of the more recent ones that have been staged. But what's interesting here is that Orfeo's quest is the focus, but it's called Eurydice. And this goes along with an idea that the item being sought, instead of the people seeking it, is the more significant part of the story. There are a lot of ways to read that, but I really think it shows the importance of Eurydice as the goal, which in a way dehumanizes her. But at the same time, it is the most human emotion to want to fight to bring back love. Go figure. What's interesting here is that Eurydice isn't actually given that much to do in it, but we also don't really get an idea of the character of Orfeo. And character hadn't become the driving force in drama at that point. And I could see how some sort of modern people who encounter it would complain that they wouldn't know what was going on or who these people were if they didn't already know the story. But you have to remember something. This was being presented to courtly viewers. Listeners. So that you could expect them to have a certain level of knowledge that would certainly include knowledge of Orpheus and Eurydice. So it's not really that problematic. You have to remember what we're seeing here, and again, this is the same thing in Shakespeare, that the work is building off of an already existing canon. A mutable canon, but a canon nonetheless. So many of these stories like this that are being presented early on are building on what everyone in the audience already knows or has an idea of, at least. There's also an interesting thought here that the power of the voice is what brings about the change. It's Orfeo singing that softens Pluto's heart. So much so that death, the most inviolate construct we know of, that can actually be violated, changed, reversed, because of the perfection of his music. And that's a big statement about the power of art. And while it's possible they never thought of any of this while they were making it, I think this story resolves happily because of the very art that is being presented. That may be a postmodernist interpretation, but I am, if nothing else, a postmodernist. So that's that. Did I achieve my goal of really liking opera? Well, I didn't hate it. And in fact, I enjoyed listening to all the versions I heard, and I enjoyed the research into it. And especially into the early history of opera. Did I learn anything? Yeah. I learned a couple of terms. Recitativo, I guess. I know what it's supposed to mean. I don't quite grok it yet, but I get it. I learned a bit about how opera in the early period were structured. That it is less about the logical this happens, this happens, this happens, this happens, this happens, as it is about this happens, reactions to it within this community of singers, then this happens in a community of action. And that really was great. And I definitely learned that there is a sense to opera that requires you to listen to the specific tones, not just the words, but how these things are delivered, that you don't really find in modern music. You don't even find that really in musical theater. It is specific to opera, at least in the West. And at some point I'll look at Eastern opera, and I have a feeling I'll need a lot more training there and a lot more help. And that's that. I Really Want to Like Opera was written and produced and recorded and edited by me, Chris Garcia. The version of Eurydice that I listened to and watched was performed by the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, directed by John Walter Hill in October of 2000. Interesting note, they used period instruments and instrumentation for the accompaniment. Now, I ain't gonna lie, most of the information I gathered here was from Wikipedia, but also YouTube. There's a couple of great people who talk about opera on YouTube, which they're a lot smarter than I am. The San Francisco Opera has a wonderful history of opera page, and there's a really cool article by Kelly Harness called Le Eurydice, Characterization and Allegory in the Eurydice de Peri and Cazzini. And that appeared in the Journal of 17th Century Music in 2003. It's a really good read. I Really Want to Like Opera is a part of the 3-Minute Modernist family of podcasts. You can find our Patreon at patreon.com/3minmodernist. That's the number 3, MINMODERNIST. And we'll be having more information and posting there regularly. Hopefully we'll be back next month. Probably shooting for monthly on this one at first. And I'm going to talk about the first English opera surviving that we know of. And that's Henry Purcell and Nahum Tate's opera, Dido Ananias. So I hope you stay tuned.